In this chapter, we will talk about data issues and alternatives to OLS techniques. This chapter is really like a mixed bag. It covers things that didn't come up earlier, and it also talks about some of the things to keep in mind when you're building your economic or econometric models. So here's the outline of the chapter. We will begin by talking about a serious problem that occurs when the correlation between your explanatory variables and your error is not equal to zero. Okay, so in that context, we'll talk about omitted variable bias and, functional form misspecification and how we can correct some of these issues as well. We will get into talking about measurement error problems that talk about measurement error in our explanatory variables or in our dependent variables, and how serious those problems are and how to fix some of those at least. And then, this part of the chapter, which is dealing with data issues, deals with non-random sampling and missing data problems, and what should you do when you have outlying observations and what techniques can be used. So in that context, we'll talk about least absolute deviations and quantile regression techniques. So let's start with this problem of what happens when the correlation between our independent variables x and our errors u is not equal to zero. The problem with that is that x becomes an endogenous explanatory variable, okay? And there are problems with this because this leads to bias. This leads to our estimators being biased and inconsistent. So typically, in the econometrics literature, you're going to find three reasons that are given for why x becomes endogenous or why this problem occurs. One is when we omit a key variable or omit key variables in our econometric model, the estimators therefore become biased and inconsistent. Okay, this can come in many different forms. Sometimes you're just really missing a variable, or sometimes you have a variable but it's not in the correct functional form. So the first part of this video will deal with that functional form misspecification. And later we'll talk about, the second problem, which is which deals with measurement error in our dependent or independent variables. And then the third part, simultaneously, we're not going to deal with that in this course, but that's going to be something that's there in part 3 of the book and will be dealt with next semester in more detail. So we're really going to be focusing on these two aspects here. So let's first try to define what do we mean by functional form misspecification. You obviously have an econometric model in place. So you've probably thought about some econometric model. You have some variables in place, right? And you've written it out. So let's say this is your econometric model. Now, functional form misspecification means that your multiple linear regression model that you wrote out does not properly account for the relationship between the dependent variables and the observed explanatory variables. So whatever this relationship is between y and these x's that we're trying to capture using this model cannot be properly accounted for because there's something missing in the functional form of how these x's or how these y's are, or this y is introduced. So like I mentioned in the previous slide, that there could be an omitted variable in your regression. So maybe you need to introduce one or more x's. Functional form misspecification is a special case in which the omitted variable is a function of an explanatory variable. And an example, that you're familiar with is, let's say we were trying to regress log wage on experience, education, female, and some other factors, right? And let's say that you thought that over time experience, the effect that experience has is nonlinear. So maybe what we are missing in this regression is like a quadratic term, right? In addition to experience can come in as a quadratic term. So if this was true, that there is a nonlinear effect of experience on wages, then the model that omits experience square is going to suffer from what we call omitted variable bias. Okay, and then we can basically say that this is, also that this regression right here without the experience square suffers from functional form misspecification. So typically, functional form misspecification comprises of, let's say, omitting quadratic terms, interaction terms. Let's say you thought female and education needs to be interacted. If you're missing that, that could be telling of functional form misspecification. Or, when you're supposed to use logs and you don't, or maybe you're not supposed to use logs and you do. So those are common examples of why this occurs. So while functional form misspecification does cause bias in our OLS estimators and makes those estimators inconsistent, all of those problems can be fixed, and while these are serious problems, they can be fixed in not such complicated ways. Okay. Now, the one thing to remember is that it's difficult to pinpoint the precise reason for functional form misspecification, because ultimately it's a functional form, right? You don't know whether a variable should be, a higher order polynomial that should be introduced in your regression, or just a quadratic, or what, right? So, or something else. So the thing to remember is that typically using quadratics, interaction terms, and logs can fix most of the functional form misspecification issues that arise because you have not incorporated a nonlinear relationship between y and x. The drawback, however, is that it can complicate the interpretation of the model. So, maybe you want to go back to some of the videos from previous chapters where we talked about how do we capture the partial effect that x has on y when x is interacting with other variables, or x is incorporated in quadratic form or log form, right? So it can sometimes complicate the interpretation of the model. And one other problem is, do you really want all of your variables to appear in quadratic forms, or do you want to interact all your variables with other variables, or just some of them, right? So now we'll focus on what can we do to detect functional form misspecification and how we fix that. Okay, so typically functional form misspecification is dealt with or is tested for by using an F-test for joint exclusion restrictions. So in the next video, we'll talk about the reset, Ramsey's reset that detects functional form misspecification.